Welcome back to Web 110 HTML and CSS. So I'm continuing with the same example from the last two videos, working with this box model and trying to make it look like a website page. And what I'm going to cover right now is going to be content that is from chapter 7, but it is going to be something that I want to see you use in your midterm, so I wanted to make sure that I went ahead and I covered it. And it's actually a really simple concept. I don't think that you're going to have a hard time with it. It's just knowing that you need to go and take a look at content that's from the previous from the next chapter. And in the midterm project, let me go ahead and open this up. I've got it listed. It has information page 236. So let me actually go look at page 236. So this is from chapter 7, and it tells you how to turn your horizontal navigation into an unordered list. The reason for this is by putting your navigation in a list, it actually structurally makes a lot of sense, because really a navigation is a list of different choices. It also gives you the option of having sublists in your navigation. Eventually in, chapter 11, I think, is where the book talks about creating like drop menus, like you might have in a larger navigation structure, and that's basically having a list inside of a list. And so we'll talk about that at some point. But what this is doing is it's structurally turning your navigation into a list. And then one of the benefits about that is you have so many more options for how you can style your links, versus right now when everything is just an anchor link. You basically can style the actual text of that link, but by putting it into this list, you can not only style the text, but you can style it as an individual item within this list, and then you can style the grouping of everything all together. Technically, you could do that if you were to put everything in kind of subgroupings. Like you could use div a little bit, or I guess you could kind of style the nav itself in a way. But this is going to give you a lot of options, and one of the really fun things, at least I think it's fun, is you can turn them into actual little buttons by using another style. And I think this is one that I didn't talk about in the last video, and that is working with rounded corners. Let me see if I can find that real quick. So this is going to be from chapter 6, and it's something that I should have talked about. It's just kind of adding on a little bit to the border, but this time you're adding radius. So you could say border radius, but if you also want to choose a particular corner, you can do border, and then you choose either the top or the bottom. So first you choose your Y information, and then you choose the X information. So first top, and then you can do border, top, left, radius, and then set that, and then that gives you that look of having rounded corners. And then the way that the navigation works, it's really straightforward. Basically, every single link that you have goes inside of an LI. Now, the biggest part of it that gets a little bit harder is that you have to add some styles to get it to work well. Because as you know, the default styles of a list are that you have markers. So you'd want to change the list style type, so you remove the markers. And in this case, they're saying to remove that from the nav UL, but you could also probably do that with the nav LI. Either one of them would work to select it. And then something else. Now, this is something that the textbook takes a while to introduce. I've been talking about it a little bit, and that is this property that is called display. Now, the default for most things is that things display as block, which means, like, if you think of like kid blocks, you stack those blocks on top of each other, and they take up the whole space. Versus something like image has a default display of inline, which means they can fall in next to each other. And if you go back to the video where I talk about images, that's something that you can see, where the images with the animals, they fall in next to each other. But when we had figures, those were block, and so they stacked on top of each other. So what happens here is if you change the default display from block, and then you overwrite that by saying display set to inline, your individual list items are going to fill in next to each other so long as there's room. And so that's going to allow for you to make it horizontal, so it'll look kind of like it has been. And then the last piece is, by default, your links have an underline. And instead, you can find other ways of creating emphasis with your navigation instead. So you can set text decoration to none, and it'll just remove that underline. And then they're also adding some padding. So rather than having to have those non-breaking space characters in order to add a little bit of space, what you can do is you can just say, I want to add a little bit of padding to the right, and it'll add a little bit of room for you. So we're going to look at that. And then there is also... No, so this part I want you to do for your midterm. The second part you don't have to do, but it can make things a little bit more fun and interesting when you're working with styling. So there's this thing that is called pseudo classes, and we're going to look at these in a couple of different places. And what it basically is saying is that you can apply styles in kind of particular scenarios, and they have a list here. So you can apply a style when something is a link, when it's a link that you've already visited. You might have seen that already if you've gone to, and it depends on your browser. So if you go to a website and you've already been to it before, a lot of times browsers, the default, it'll switch the color to purple, for example. And usually a default for a link is blue. So your default link could be blue, visited could be purple. And then focus is triggered when the hyperlink has keyboard focus. And then hover is when the mouse pointer moves over the hyperlink. So if you are hovering your mouse over it, and then active is when you are actually clicking on it. And let me look. I surprisingly don't seem to have an example under this week. Let me look ahead a little bit, because we will come back to looking at these. All right, so I don't have a link right now to these, but a good place that you can look for this is on the W3 Schools. And I just went to Google and I searched pseudo classes and then W3 Schools. If you go to the W3 Schools website, we can search for this, and what it does is it actually is searching, I believe, with a search engine instead to find it. So sometimes I think searching for things on W3 Schools is a little bit awkward. Sometimes I actually think it's easier to do a search in Google or something instead, but I'm just going to do a search here. So even though I don't have this linked on Canvas, you could do this, and I can click on this, and it's going to go over a bunch of other styles. Like if we'll come back to this because eventually we will want to revisit some of these other ones. You can see there's this huge list. Basically, when we look at tables, we'll come back, and then also maybe forms. But what we're interested in is there's this example here, anchor pseudo classes. And so we have basically, if we have not clicked on it, it's going to be red. If we have visited it before, so if I click on it and then I go back, let me refresh this. Oh, is it not going to remember? Maybe this might have to depend on your browser, but this should now show as green because I've been to it before, but it could just be relaunching it every time. Since it's opening it in a new tab, it might be kind of ruining that from actually really showing correctly. All right, so, and then we've got color is hot pink if I hover over it. So you might be able to tell the difference. It's turning this pink color. And then if I'm currently clicking on it, it's going to be blue. So in that process of clicking on it, and just like any of our styles, we want to go from broad to specific. So first, the most general one is a link, and the next general would be visited because it's kind of this past state of being. And then hovering is more active, and then clicking is going to be most specific because as you are clicking, you are probably also hovering, so you wouldn't want to accidentally overwrite it. So you would want to write these styles in this way, but this gives you a lot of options where you can basically change it. So when you're hovering over it, you can make the color change, but you could also do this for other things. Like here it's saying we're changing this about the anchor link, but you could also say, I want it to change not only the text color, but maybe also the background color. And that's where I wanted to kind of show you a little bit in the book. Like here they've got, if you are hovering over this print this page button, and they've got some other examples where they have this vertical navigation instead, and then they got some other practice. So you'll eventually get to have practice one way or the other, but I just wanted to include this real quick in this particular example. So the first thing we would need to do is turn our navigation into a UL. And probably the easiest thing is going to be creating each of these first and then just putting the link inside of it. So I'm going to move these real quick. Hopefully you all feel pretty confident in working with lists in general. Again, I think like the hardest part of it's the styles, but I have that page written on there, and as long as you kind of have a general idea of the styles, you should be fine. So let me get that page again. All right, so we've got our box model, refresh. So now we've got where it's just looking like this list. So we want to go back up here, and in the order of things, we've got our H1 first, and then we've got our paragraph. So I'm probably going to say between these is where I'm going to put my nav styles. And this will give us some practice with our descendant selectors. We haven't really done a whole lot of those. So navigation wise, I don't know that we actually need to really do anything. So we could just jump straight into our UL. And if you want to, you could do something just like the textbook. And you can be more specific too. So we're basically saying the unordered list inside of the nav, the list items inside of the nav, and the anchor links inside the nav. But if we wanted to, we could be more specific. We could say the list items that are in the UL that are in the nav, you know, if we had other ones, but since we don't, we can keep it more simple. So with our, like right now looking at this, we've got these markers, and so we need to remove those. And you could do nav UL or nav LI. So I'm going to say list style, whoops, I'm combining it in my head, list style type, none. So that's going to remove those markers. And then right now the display is block. They're all stacking over top of each other. So I'm going to say I want the display to be inline, and then that will make it so they're next to each other. And let me do this piece by piece so you can actually see the difference. So this is removing the markers. This is display inline, so it's going to make them next to each other, and you'll see there it's a little crowded, so we might need to space these out a little bit. And then our navigation, that's where we're going to remove the underline. So that's called text decoration. And then we're going to say none. It's going to remove that. And then from here, you can kind of do whatever you want. Now, the example in the book, it said that we might want to add a little bit of space to the side. Let me zoom back out of that. And a lot of times our navigation will be to the right. So I could say, well, actually, I want this whole nav UL. Maybe you want to have this have text align right. And then I'll move it to the right. And then from there, I might say, I want the, and this kind of also depends. Do you want the LI or the anchor links? I like to think of the whole LI as a button. So I'm going to say, I want the padding, padding right maybe be like 10 pixels, just kind of bump them off from each other. But then also that adds just a little bit of space where it bumps away from the side. I really don't like things being too close to the edges. So that kind of adds a little bit of space. But then what we could also do is we could say, actually with this LI, I want to have a border. Let's keep it simple for now. 1 pixel solid, and we'll just make that black. So now we have a button. And here what we could do is we could start thinking about that button. And that's where maybe instead of padding, maybe margin would work better, because now it looks really lopsided. So I can say, actually, I want the margin to be to the right. So we still have that spacing. But now since we've got the border, we might want a little bit more space. So we could say, let's have some padding of 5 pixels. And so that'll make it look a little bit more like a button. And then we could also bring in that border radius, because usually we have this idea that when things are rounded, usually they're clickable. So that would help signal to our users that it would be clickable. So I could say border radius, and let me do 5 pixels starters. That doesn't look too bad. And so now we actually have these as buttons, and you could actually go ahead and add like a box shadow, might be something that you'd be interested in. You could change the color on this, and then this is where we could use those pseudo classes too, because we could say, actually, I want the navigation anchor link color, and you want to make sure there's no spaces between these, and you could say, I want this, I'm going to go with the kind of browser defaults. I'm going to say, I want it to be blue. And then I could say, but when it's visited, again, kind of a browser default usually is purple. So I want it to be purple. And then I could say, if I am hovering over top of it, I want it to be red. And then maybe I could say, while I am clicking on it, so that's active, I want the color to be green. So it's kind of pulling in all of our colors. I could save that, refresh. So now I can click on it, go back. Let me see if I can refresh it. So it looks like, at least in my browser, it's not remembering the visited color. Depending on if you're using another one, it might work for you. But hover, at least it's turning red. And then it's also, if it's active, it's turning green if I'm clicking on it. And then you could do something similar too, though. You could change it. So if you are hovering over it, you could also have it change the background color, for example. So maybe for one of these, let's try background color. So now if I'm hovering over it, that background color is turning black. You'll notice though, that background color, it's not taking up the whole space. So then you would want to think, is it the navigation anchor link that I'm interested in hovering and having change? Or is it the navigation LI that I want to change? So maybe you actually want to add this padding instead. Now, there's not necessarily a right and wrong answer. It's just you kind of figuring out whatever works best for you. So I could say, okay, well, that's not really working with what I'm picturing. So maybe instead of having the padding be applied to the LI, I want it to be applied to our anchor link. You'll notice now it looks a little bit different because of it, but now I have kind of hovering over. It's creating other problems though, because we've got this border radius. So we might have to move the border radius as well. And so on and so forth. You might just have to just kind of keep changing things until you get it basically the way that you want to. Let me zoom in a little bit so it's a little easier to see what's going on. So it's not the worst, but it's definitely not done. It needs more work. But the reason I wanted to show this to you is because this very well could be something that you might be very interested in doing and playing with when you are making your own website. So that way your navigation isn't going to be just kind of a very traditional kind of boring, outdated sort of look. This could definitely help you a lot. And you could even do interesting things like you could have this like you could have this radial gradient or something. That might be something that could be interesting to have on a button. You could add it so you've got a drop shadow on these buttons too to make them look a little bit more interactive. All right, so for now, with pseudo classes, that's going to be all I'm going to talk about until we get to a later chapter where I'm going to end up talking about working with them for tables. Again, you do not have to do this part of it with the pseudo classes. You don't have to add that to the midterm. You are going to need to have this unordered list, but it's really straightforward, and you can find all of that information on, I think it was 236. Horizontal navigation with an unordered list. They've got the HTML side of things on this page. You would just have to swap out the links and the names. And then they've got the styles here. There's really nothing here in the styles that would really lead you astray too much. This padding right, that would be optional, but everything else is really standard, basic kind of styles. And then if you wanted to, you could kind of take a look at some of this stuff too. So that gives you kind of a couple of different options of looking at it. You could also use basically like what I have here, where I had it right aligned and everything. They'll give you kind of some options. All right, so if you've got any questions about working with the navigation as an unordered list, you can put a comment in the discussion, or you can send me an email.